Okay, thank you. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Kent Branch September 2024 educational webinar. My name is Cindy Robichaux. I am part of the Kent Branch operating team and your host for this evening, and thank you for joining us on this Friday night. We do have a couple housekeeping items. Our presentations are recorded and available on our Kent Branch YouTube channel. This channel is free and open to everyone. Your microphones and your cameras have been turned off, but we welcome your questions. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, a little chat bar will pop up and there'll be a little chat icon. If you click on it, a chat box will open. Here you can type in your messages and questions for us or for the speaker. Angela Churchill is monitoring the chat box tonight for us. So thank you, Angela. Before we begin tonight's presentation, Bob Daly, member of the Lenape Nation and a Kent Branch member, offers a territory acknowledgement. Sorry, guys, I'm gonna find my little, there it is.
The land on which we gather, learn, and play is the traditional territory of the Atawandaran, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lunapawak, and Potawatomi peoples who have long-standing relationships to the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. The local First Nations of this area include Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Caldwell First Nation, Chippewa of Kettle and Stony Point, Oneida Nation of the Thames, the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, the Munsee Delaware Nation, and Walpole Island First Nation. Additionally, there is a growing urban indigenous population who make the cities of southwestern Ontario home. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations of Turtle Island.
Thank you, Bob. So let's get started. For anyone joining us for the first time, let me tell you a little bit about Ontario Ancestors. Ontario Ancestors is also known as the Ontario Genealogical Society, is a nonprofit registered charity which was founded in 1961. It is the largest genealogical society in Canada with a mission to encourage, bring together, and assist those interested in the pursuit of family history and preserving Ontario's genealogical heritage. Be sure to visit the website to learn more about resources and support that can assist you in your family history research. Ontario Ancestors has over 30 branches and special interest groups all across Ontario, and we are the Kent branch. We are the local family history group here in Chatham, Kent. We are based at the Chatham Kent Public Library. We offer assistance and education for all researchers. And our mission is to promote and preserve local history and family history. Our family history library is located on the second floor of the Chatham Kent Public Library in Chatham. It holds over 50 years worth of historical and genealogical resources for Chatham Kent. We are open to the public Fridays and Saturdays from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. And we also try to accommodate other times by appointment. We always like to connect with people interested in genealogy and local history. You can contact us at this email. You can also join our Kent Branch Facebook group, which has over 900 people who are interested in genealogy in Chatham Kent's history. And we also have a very comprehensive website with lots of resources for both our branch members, but also for the general public. Here's some information about our upcoming October webinar. Our October webinar is sure to be of interest to many genealogists and historians. We will co-host this webinar with the Essex branch. On October the 8th, which is a Tuesday night instead of a Friday night, at 7 p.m., we welcome Dana Palmer to discuss photo restoration and storage. Details on how to register can be found on the Kent branch and the Essex branch websites. So let's get to tonight's presentation, the story of Jack Beardall and CFCO. We are very pleased to have Michael Anderson join us. Oh, Anderson. I apologize, Michael. Michael Alexander
Oh,
join
that's
us.
okay. That used to happen to me at Tecumseh High School because there was a Michael Anderson there.
Oh, well, there you go.
So,
Michael is Jack's only grandson. He holds law degrees from the University of Toronto and Columbia University and has a litigation practice based in Toronto. Carrying on the family tradition of communications, Michael is also a best-selling author, professional speaker, and media commentator. I guess that apple didn't fall far from the tree, did it, Michael? Welcome, and I'll hand over the webinar to you now. Thanks for joining us.
okay, thank you, Cindy. So do I have to share my screen again, or are you?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So what happened to my share screen? Hold on. I've lost my, hold on, maybe I can pull it up here.
Sure.
There we go. There we go. Got it. Okay. Share. So, do we have it?
Yes, sir. Looks great.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with everybody tonight. I ran into Cindy at the Chatham Kent Wall of Fame ceremony in October of last year when Jack was inducted into the Wall of Fame. And I gave a speech there and told people a bit about this project at that time. So we've kind of come full circle almost a year later, and we finally gotten together to talk about this. I just want to show you, before I show you the slide presentation itself, I want to give you some background as to why I got, deeply involved in doing this. I own the CFCO archive, and for many, many years, I wanted to do something with it because it's got a lot of very important historical information in it and a lot of incredible pictures. My grandfather was very interested in art photography, and so I've got a lot of art photos and a lot of photos about Chatham and throughout the decades from the early part of the 20th century until his death in 1969. He was taking photos right up until the last few weeks before his death. And I wanted to do something with it at some point and make a donation to the local museum, just so there was an historical record of who did what, how the station was founded, what its accomplishments were, and so on. And I was somewhat motivated to do that because in 1976, when CFCO had its 50th anniversary, a gentleman who knew my grandfather was interviewed and claimed to have played a significant role in the development of the station in its early years. And unfortunately, this was not true. This was very disappointing to members of the family. And anyway, eventually the whole thing was resolved. But I wanted to make sure that in the future, there was a clear historical record of the station, and there wouldn't be any disputes in the future about Jack's role and his early achievements and so on. That sense, the project was not something that I really was thinking about rolling out to the public. I just wanted to get the history in the record. And that was my original intention. And over the years, I've been dragging all of these photos and films and recordings and old style records the size of pizzas and play from the inside out. I've been dragging that stuff around with me. And finally, about 10, 12 years ago, I started taking all this material and digitizing it. So I'm really actually glad that I waited as long as I did to engage in this restoration and preservation project, because digital technology has made it possible to do things that would have been impossible to do, say, if I had embarked on this project in the 1970s or the 80s or even the 1990s. So my approach to these photos, by the way, which we're going to take a look at tonight, I have taken, about 350 photos. And I taught myself Photoshop Pro and dumped these photos into Photoshop, and I guess I could say painstakingly restored a lot of them. I mean, they were pretty well preserved, but some of them were damaged. I mean, some of them are over 100 years old. So, the photos started to deteriorate. And some things, there were accidents, some important photos were torn. So I just embarked on trying to restore these to the highest possible standard. In some cases, I restored parts of the photo pixel by pixel. Some of the photos took me anywhere from 10 to 14 hours to restore. And this is partly what you're going to see tonight, partly the fruits of my labor. And so I am building a website right now all about CFCO. It's called CFCO The Story. It'll get rolled out later this fall. And so all these items that I've restored will be on that site, and they'll be organized according to year. And just to give you an example, so say in the 1930s, I've got station announcers, station equipment, station programs. So the photos and the memorabilia will be divided thematically for each decade that CFCO was in operation. So I think it's going to be a very rich presentation. I'm trying to make it very accessible, so people can go in and just look at what they want to look at. And I'm rolling this larger project out now because we're coming up on CFCO's 100th anniversary in 1926. And so, and I've been talking to the station, and when CFCO The Story gets rolled out later this fall, we're going to have a media day in Chatham. Just to make people aware of the CFCO story in anticipation of the 100th anniversary. And so the whole project has taken on dimensions that I originally never contemplated. There's another reason that the project became bigger than I first thought. I talked about this at the Wall of Fame induction. Though I spent a lot of time with my grandfather as a kid, I used to stay over at his place every Saturday night, would spend part of the weekend there, and frequently saw him during the week. Though I spent so much time with him, he never spoke to me about his success or his achievements or, what he had done with the station. As I said during the Wall of Fame induction speech, it wasn't about him. It was all about me. And I was the talent and he was the producer. So the focus of everything he did was about allowing me to explore myself. And so I knew he had this impressive bio, but I didn't really understand in some ways what it meant. And as I got into this project, I realized that he was more of a radio pioneer than I ever understood. So when he passed away, newspapers around Ontario, the headlines were "Radio Pioneer Jack Beardall passes away at the age of 72." So, but I didn't understand fully what that meant until I got into the project. And I began to realize that it had an importance historically for the community and for the radio industry that previously I just had not understood. And now I'm working with some people in Chatham to roll out something I'm calling the Jack Beardall Innovation Project. Because the reason Jack's story is, I think, relevant, which is why I call this presentation Chatham's First High-Tech Entrepreneur, is that the techniques and the methods that Jack employed to build one of the first privately owned radio stations in the country were the same techniques and methods and so on that have been used by people who were in Silicon Valley and the North Carolina Triangle and other places. I mean, his way of approaching the world, his methods of building the business, his outlook, all of those things. I mean, if he were alive today and he were a young person, he would fit right in. I mean, he was in that sense very modern. So I began to see that this information I had might be helpful or relevant to younger people in the Chatham-Kent community who might be inspired by this story and find ways of thinking about their own lives and how they might achieve something in the high-tech field. So that's what led to this somewhat larger presentation that has, several different purposes. And I guess you'll see through some of the slides we'll look at tonight how it is that I came to understand the true significance of CFCO. And what I thought I would do, I'd love to do the full slideshow for you on this part of the CFCO, the story exhibit. This is kind of the introduction. It's a capsule summary of Jack and the station. If I were just play the whole slideshow for you, I don't think that would be too effective in this context. I think what would be better is for me to choose some key slides and talk a bit about those slides and go beyond the text that is with the slides. And I think you might find that more engaging than just going through the slides. By the way, if you do want to go through the slides, you can go onto my law firm website, which is www.litigationworks.com. And so that's litigationworks.com. And you'll find in the communications section that this whole presentation is set up. Unfortunately, it does not work as well, given the limitations, some of the limitations of technology. It does not work as well in a website format as it does if I just play it here for you. So it's a little slower at some points, and some transitions are not as clean as I would like them to be. But if you want to see the full slideshow beginning to end, you can do it right there. And I just want to show you how this works and how I've set this up. So if we were in slideshow mode, I'm just trying to get the bar out of the way here. Okay. I've used a lot of Ken Burns effects to bring some sort of a dynamic feel to the presentation. I like what this said when Jack retired in 1962. Victor Lauriston, who I'm sure many of you know about, who was a lawyer and an extraordinary writer, he had a column in the Chatham Daily News, and it was a tribute to what Jack had done, and the article was entitled, "This Parting Brings Sorrow." And this is a great summary of what Jack did. For Jack, what he did here in Chatham through so many years was not work, but a hobby. He began with a new idea whose possibilities no one really foresaw. In playing with that idea, he created an important industry and a vital community service. In his Sunday morning farewell address, Jack dealt in characteristically painstaking detail with the technical aspects of an achievement that will always amaze and gratify us. So I'm going to go back to some of these, but I just wanted to show you how these things transition. This is Jack, and one of his early pursuits was race cars. And he had a Ford Model T race car that he purchased when he was in his late teens or early 20s. I don't know how he was able to afford it, but he eventually flipped it at 60 miles an hour into the ditch at Charing Cross Road. He was pinned beneath it. His co-pilot on this speed run was Wesley Barrett. Fortunately, he was thrown free of the car, and he managed to pull Jack out from beneath it, or Jack would have drowned in that ditch. So, but for Wesley Barrett, I wouldn't be here, and CFCO wouldn't be here today. Just let me go back to this photo. You may notice this is at Maple Leaf Cemetery. So, what's remarkable about Jack in the early years is he was fascinated with all of the technological developments of the late 19th and early 20th century. So he had one of the first sports cars that was made by Ford. He was interested in photography. When films became something that people could create on their own, he got very involved in filmmaking. He was fascinated by steam power. He's fascinated by trains. And this is a theme that continued throughout his life. And, I have a tape where he's talking about, his early inspirations. And he said that he was primarily motivated by the desire to understand how things work. And so, I think that he had, though he didn't have formal training as an engineer, he was somehow had the gift of thinking like an engineer. And so he was interested in understanding how all the different technological developments of the time, he was interested in understanding them, as best he could, and with some depth. He was somebody who was involved in study and experimentation on a regular basis. We've already gone here. I've already previewed for you this accident that was covered in the Chatham Daily News. 2 Chatham youths narrowly escaped death. And here's a really important picture. This is Jack in 1917. He was in the Canada Business College, and he dropped out to join the Royal Flying Corps in Toronto. And this is where he was introduced to the Allies' secret weapon, which was wireless voice communication. This is something that they were using with their fighter planes. And he apparently, I infer from everything that I've read and seen, that he was involved as ground crew in a wireless voice communication. So I think he saw right there what his future was. The future was going to be radio. That was the next big thing on the horizon. So he came back to Chatham at the end of the war and worked on a plan to become one of the first Canadians to build a privately owned radio station. And here's his first license, issued for 1921, 1922. And it's fascinating here because, here it is. It is issued by the Department of the Naval Service, because there's no CRTC, no communications branch. I think this is kind of you had to get permission from the military to in fact engage in radio experiments. So Jack got this license to operate receiving equipment. So he could receive radio signals if there were any out there. But soon thereafter, he got a license to also broadcast. So in 1922, he starts broadcasting from the basement of his home to anyone in the local area who happened to have a radio receiver. How he built this equipment, how he got a hold of all the components, I have no idea. But this is, in fact, you might say CFCO in its first iteration. The second iteration comes just a few years later, in 1925. So this is the unit that you saw in the first photograph. And then the station becomes BE9AT. Now this is under a special experimental license issued by the government. So Jack is given permission to experiment with radio technology. And this is really interesting. Look at this over here. These are 600 Edison storage batteries. Again, I don't know where he was getting the money to buy 600 batteries. It must have been phenomenally expensive. But that's how he was able to power the station. And this is carried forward to 1926, which is the next iteration of the station. It is called 10BT, and it goes out under the name Western Ontario Better Radio Club. So when you were trying to get a radio station off the ground, you just didn't start broadcasting. There was kind of an intermediate stage, probably recommended by the government, where you could start a radio club. Okay, so it was not for profit. There were 3,000 members of the radio club. In 1926, it built its membership very quickly. And this little station broadcast throughout parts of Ontario, into Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And there were members of Station 10BT in the US states. So CFCO didn't actually, in its first, its first official iteration did not, it wasn't strictly a local enterprise. It was from the very beginning reaching out beyond Chatham to the greater world. And that's a consistent theme with the station over the years. 10BT, those are call letters or station identification provided by the government. BT means Beardall transmitter. So if you had a transmitter, you got your initials on it. And 10 refers to the province of Ontario, which was assigned the number 10. So the station's first musical program with live talent in 1926 features Mr. S.S. Kennedy on harmonica. Now, CFCO in its very early years has a number of firsts in the areas of programming and, more importantly, as we'll see in a moment, in radio technology itself. But in 1927, Jack creates the first program in the country that's dedicated to the interests of rural listeners. It's called the Farm and Home Hour. And it eventually, over the years, develops and becomes, when I'm a kid, Harold Smith's Farm Report. So this started way back here in 1927, and it was a big first for the station. I really love this picture. It took me a while to restore it. A lot of these photos had kind of a dingy background, which I thought was just the deterioration of the paper. So I started playing around with filters. And what I discovered is that the variations and what appeared to be corruption was, in fact, that all of those things were clouds. And so in some of these photos, I put a blue filter on the background so that you could actually see what the photo is expressing, as well as this lovely smoke here. But now, this was a fascinating discovery for me, because here we are in 1929, the CNR and the CPR get involved in radio at a very early stage, and Jack collaborates with both of them. He's a charter member of the CNR radio network and the CPR radio network. But this train, which is the Montreal to Chicago Flyer, I believe, going through Chatham, has radio on board. So here we are, we're in the infancy of radio, really. And the CNR is equipping passenger trains with radio sets. And so if you're a passenger on this train, you can get a headset and you can listen to radio. And as the train moves along the tracks, it picks up whatever the local signal is. So when it got close to Chatham, it would pick up CFCO. And then as it got farther outside of Chatham, the signal would begin to diminish. And I suppose eventually it would pick up Windsor and or Detroit. So people who are on this long run on their way to Chicago would hear CFCO when they were passing through town. CFCO moved into the William Pitt in 1930. So the pit had just been built, and so it was a pretty fancy Art Deco hotel for the time. And Jack put the station, the actual broadcasting part of the station, on the mezzanine of the hotel. So as people went in and out of the hotel, they could see the radio station, the announcers and the equipment and the programs, which I think must have been pretty thrilling for people at the time. They did something similar here in Toronto. I forget which station did it, but one of the stations around this time also established itself on the mezzanine of the Royal York Hotel. So I don't know whether Jack got the idea from the Royal York or vice versa, or whether that was just a practice at the time. The rest of the operation, I assume the business offices were on the 4th floor. And CFCO was at the William Pitt for many years. So this is a picture of the Presbyterian Church around the time of King George, 1930. And I put this photo in because it's about how CFCO was built out into the community. So on the one hand, it's reaching out to the larger world, into the US, but it's also establishing itself very securely within the community. And so Jack, at his own expense, strings 24 different lines to 24 public spaces in the city, including 11 churches. So you'd have City Hall and, the arena where the hockey games were played. So any public venue where you might want radio, he strung wires to make that possible. And he, of course, strung wires to this church, which was his own church. Now, here's another first for the station. Here's my grandmother. And this is something that I didn't know anything about until I got deep into the archive during the COVID lockdowns. My grandmother may have had the very first program, women's program, in Canadian radio. And certainly, if it wasn't the first, it was probably one of the first. And so she hosted and produced her own show, which I think began in the late 20s. This picture is in the early 1930s in the William Pitt Hotel in one of the studios. And the program is called Mainly for Women. And so Ruby provides, as I say, timely tips on cuisine, fashion, and household management. And this becomes a regular feature on CFCO for 30 years. And my mother, when she gets older, sometimes guest hosts the program when my grandmother is not available. So this was something that I learned about the station that was quite surprising. I had no idea that my mother and my grandmother were both involved in programming at the station for many, many years. So this goes back to the theme of CFCO reaching out to the greater world. And this is the famous bathtub of letters. So during the early 1930s, Jack decides to experiment with shortwave broadcasting, which during the night would allow him to bounce a signal off the atmosphere to see where it might end up. And by broadcasting this way, he was able to significantly increase the reach of the signal of the station. So they decided to broadcast a series of all-night programs. And these are called DX programs or distant signal programs. And they asked anyone who heard the station and liked what they heard to write to the station and, sort of send a fan letter and let CFCO know that they liked what they had heard. And the response was overwhelming. They got over 20,000 letters from literally all over the world, from places as far away as New Zealand. So this is a pretty extraordinary achievements. We're in Chatham, Ontario, a city at that time, I think, of about 16,000 people. And it is literally broadcasting to the entire world. This is 1932. This is just another iteration of basic station equipment. And this is what CFCO would look like from another angle. These are the towers on top of the William Pitt Hotel. They were illuminated at night. So I think it became kind of a beacon for the entire city. When you're driving to town, you would see the CFCO towers as a point of reference. Here's the tower at night. We have down here Harrison Hall. So now I just want to take you through some of the technological firsts of the station. I mean, the DX signal programs, I mean, that was unusual and quite remarkable, but it's not officially part of the record of technological firsts for the station. So, you establish that your frequency, the frequency of your radio signal, by passing the signal through a crystal. So you can see the crystal at the top of the screen here. Now, at that time, crystals were manufactured by third parties. And the Canadian Radio Broadcast Commission set a standard for frequency modulation. So if CFCO were at 6:30 a.m., you could deviate 50 cycles up to 680 or further down 50 cycles to 580. So you could broadcast between 580 and 680 if you were at 630. Okay, so that's how much space you had. Well, Jack was dissatisfied with this, so he decided to grind and polish his own crystals. And he was able to do something that nobody thought possible, which is he reduced signal variance to 0. So you could find CFCO always at 6:30 a.m. You didn't have to go up and down the dial to find where it was at any particular time. And so this led Colonel Steele, who was the head of the technical branch of the Broadcast Commission, to announce that CFCO had the finest composite transmitter in the country. Here's another first for CFCO. It is the CFCO weather station. So this is the roof of the William Pitt. You can't see the full weather station here. This is just part of it. There are 10 instruments deployed here across the roof of the hotel. Now, CFCO was the first station in the country to get government approval for an official weather station. So other stations might talk about the weather or say what, whether it's sunny or whether it's raining or whatever, but none of them had the right to provide official reports upon which the public and industry could rely. So CFCO was the very first station to do that. So then the forecast became just indispensable for farming in southwestern Ontario and for shipping in the Great Lakes. I think I missed one achievement here, which is the most important one. Let me go back. This is the most important technological innovation of the early CFCO period. Radio equipment had to be powered by DC current because AC current, is alternating current. And so if you plug radio equipment directly into an AC outlet, you get a modulation of the signal because the current is constantly alternating. And so the only way to get a smooth radio signal that's pleasant to the ear, whether it's music or whether we're talking about broadcasting and announcing, the only way to get that is to convert the AC current to DC. And so the way that was done was with huge steam engines, with generators that were plugged into the wall. And so they took the AC current and the generator converted to DC. And that was plugged directly into the radio equipment. Now, the problem with this is that these machines were big, they were bulky, and they could be very unreliable. So Jack decided to create something better. So he and a fellow inventor, Norm Olding, got together and they designed a small transformer, a black box transformer. I think of it as probably being the size of a bread box. Maybe it was a little bigger. And this was designed to be plugged directly into AC current. And it would transform the AC into DC without going through this clumsy process of using a generator. So Jack and Norm took the plans for this to the Donegal Transformer Factory in Michigan. And they showed the plans to the engineers and said, we would like you to build this. And the engineers came back to them after reviewing the plans and said, look, boys, we don't want to take your money. This is never going to work. And so Jack insisted, no, you've warned us. We're willing to go ahead anyway. You make it, we'll pay for it, and let's see what happens. So Donegal made it. It was delivered to Chatham, and Jack plugged it in, and it worked like a charm. So it was the first compact transformer that was able to directly convert AC current to DC. And I think this is a first for all of North America. In fact, it's certainly a first in Canada, but I do believe it's a first for North America. I wish Jack were around today because I would like to ask him why he did not patent the transformer and just go into the transformer business himself. But anyway, I think this is the biggest technological innovation of CFCO, and it literally transformed technically the way that broadcasting was conducted in Canada and the US. So due to CFCO's early achievements, its early technological and programming achievements, it developed quite a profile in the radio industry. And normally on, well, let me take a step back. Starting in 1932, the CBC produced a Christmas Day broadcast that went around the world. So it went to all the Commonwealth countries and was available in other parts, I assume, but specifically they wanted to reach the Commonwealth countries. And the Christmas Day broadcast was also picked up by CBS and broadcast throughout the entire US. Normally, each of the Commonwealth countries would provide a feed for part of the broadcast, but the feed would be provided by an official broadcaster. I mean, in Canada, of course, the CBC would have provided the feed for the Christmas Day broadcast. But because of CFCO's seminal achievements, the CBC decided to ask CFCO to provide the feed to the BBC for the worldwide broadcast in 1937. So that was an extraordinary moment for CFCO. It was a moment of recognition of all the hard work and the early achievements. And according to Jack, the CFCO feed reached over 50% of the radio listeners around the world. So it reached tens of millions of people. Here's something else that I never fully realized about my grandfather. I mean, I knew, of course, he was involved with the Canadian Broadcasters Association and the regulation of radio. But I didn't fully realize that he was elected to serve as a member of the board of directors of the Canadian Broadcasters Association. So he was elected in 37 and I think again in 46. So this is very interesting. I just did not know that he was involved in the national business of radio at that level. But there are other achievements in that regard that I'll bring to your attention in a moment. Now, even though Jack was conducting experiments at CFCO, he continued to conduct experiments at home with his own ham radio set. So here we are during the 1930s at home. He has his own radio station going out of his own radio room in his home. And as you can see, it was a pretty complex setup. And he always had his home radio station so that he could, in his spare time, broadcast to other ham operators around the world. In fact, when I used to stay over at his place on Saturday mornings, we would often get on his ham radio set. Here it is. This is the 1960s. So we go there from the 30s. This is what the ham station looked like in the 1960s. And we would sit there and we put on our headsets and we would talk to people all over the world. I think my last conversation with him was with an operator from South Africa. Let's see here. In 1947, CFCO made a huge investment in a new transmitter. It had been broadcasting unbelievably at 100 watts, which was more than enough for the time to reach the audience that CFCO wanted to reach. But in 1947, Jack decided to go up to 1,000 watts and had equipment custom built by Northern Electric. And he bought a 40-acre property on the outskirts of the city and built a transmitter house. The station remained on King Street, the actual broadcasting site, but the signal and the transmitter were based here at the farmhouse, in effect, on Highway 40. Here's my mother. This is when she was a concert pianist, and this is another thing I discovered through the archive, is that she had been cutting and records and recording at CFCO studios from the time that she was a teenager. And I have a collection of her records. And she went on from Chatham to study at the University of Toronto under the guidance of Alberto Guerrero, who was one of the world's greatest concert virtuosos at that time. He was from South America, but had a worldwide reputation. And my mother was chosen as part of a group of 13 students at the Royal Conservatory at the University of Toronto just to study with Guerrero and to work in his studio. So my mother was officially known as an artist in Guerrero's studio throughout her time at the conservatory and thereafter. And this was quite an extraordinary group of people. My mother's classmate in that studio was Glenn Gould, who was a family friend. So this just goes to another aspect of Jack's involvement with the Canadian Broadcasters Association. They had a quarter century club. So for all of those people who've been in radio for 25 years, there's special recognition and an award. And if you were in the Pioneer Club, which had a fixed membership, I think of 32 or 36, I think we've got a slide about that. The club was for all the people who got in on the ground floor of radio back in the 1920s and 1930s. So Jack was a member of the Pioneer Club, but he was the chairman of the Quarter Century Club. And so from 1953 to 1962, he gave a speech at the Canadian Broadcasters Association every year, and he was responsible for recognizing other people who had served in the radio industry for 25 years or more. Jack was also a charter member of the Broadcast Executive Society based in Toronto, starting in 1961. So I mention these business achievements because this is another way in which I came to understand that CFCO was a major player in the radio industry. And it was a player technologically, it was a player on the business side, it was a player in the early years in playing a role in crafting the rules and regulations that guided broadcasting in Canada. Now, one interesting thing about CFCO's programming is that Jack, from the 1920s onward, had his own Sunday morning broadcast called the Chatter Period. And it started off as a mail-in program. So people of course, had a lot of questions about this new technology called radio. And their radios would break down and they would have troubles of various kinds. And also just questions in general about this new phenomenon. So they would write to Jack and he would read the letters during this Sunday morning broadcast, which lasted for about 30 minutes. And then he would answer the questions. But over the years, this became a kind of general interest program where Jack talked about all kinds of things, his travels to different parts of the world, what he thought about upcoming civic elections, and so on. But all of this was from a nonpartisan human interest standpoint. And even though CFCO, before there was television, carried major U.S. programming, they carried Ed Sullivan, Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Lauren Green. It was really very modern in that respect. It's much like, say, Global TV in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, carrying American programming and bringing it up to Canada. CFCO had Canadian programming, but it also had the best of American programming. But even though it had this very cutting-edge programming approach, Jack's Sunday morning chatter period remained CFCO's most popular program throughout the history of the station, which is, I guess, is a testament to the sense of community that Jack engendered through the station and his community involvement, which cut across many different organizations like Rotary and his church and the library, the Chamber of Commerce, the Camera Club, and so on. So Jack sold the station in 1962. It's an interesting story as to why that happened. Because my mother and my grandmother did not want him to sell the station, and there was no need to sell the station. I asked my grandfather one day, I must have been about 10 years old. I asked him why he sold the station. And apparently the station had been unionized in the late 1950s, first by the Teamsters. And as it turned out, the Teamsters were representing the employees for 2 years without being properly certified. So the whole union arrangement at CFCO was based initially on a fraud. But eventually the union was properly certified, and it was connected in some way with the CBC. So Jack's experience with the unions was not very pleasant. But he was a very good negotiator, and he was. I have about 6-7 hours of tapes of labor negotiations from the late 1960s and early 70s, from which I learned a lot about the station and about the industry generally. And Jack had a really kind of genial way of negotiating, where he would tell jokes and stories. So he'd get to a very tense point in negotiations, and he would lighten things up, and he orchestrated the negotiations. I've learned so much from listening to those tapes. I wish I had listened to them many years ago, and I would have been a better negotiator. But in any event, I'm missing the point. Sorry. He said to me he sold the station because he didn't want somebody else telling him how to run his business. Those are his exact words. So, he built this station when the state wasn't there to bail you out. Nobody's going to help him if he failed. He did it on his own initiative with his own money. And he was truly a rugged individual and completely self-reliant. And I just don't think that he could, tolerate the union telling him, as he said, how to run his station. So that's why he sold CFCO in 1962 to McLean Hunter Broadcasting, based in Toronto. So, but Jack did retire to his ham radio operation and remained very active in radio until the time of his death. And, he started off with sports cars, but he ended up ordering a custom-built Rolls-Royce in the mid-1960s, when Rolls-Royce became a car that could be owner-driven rather than a car that needed a chauffeur. And this car was a great delight to him, not only because of his intense interest in cars, which obviously goes back to the early 1900s. I mean, he and I used to go to car shows all the time and buy car magazines and car books. It was an obsession with us. But Jack bought the Rolls. It was not only a reward for all the years of hard work, but he was fascinated by the technology of a car. And it was a cutting-edge vehicle in many different ways. It had disc brakes on all 4 wheels, which was virtually unheard of at the time. It had 3 braking systems. So there was the primary braking system, and there were 2 backup systems. He was fascinated by that. It had independent suspension all the way around, and I could go on and on and on, but I could give you a whole lecture about what's unique about this car. But this is what was characteristic of Jack after he sold the station. He remained involved in all the latest technological developments in the world. So he had the Rolls because it was so technologically advanced. When the first portable color TV came out, he got that. When the first remote control TV came out, he got that. When there was the latest version of a photographer's camera came out, he wanted to get that. But he wanted to understand the technology. And he approached all of those things from that standpoint. So when he ordered the Rolls-Royce, he did something unprecedented, really, which is that he, as the owner, ordered the mechanic's shop manual. And I remember as a kid, he would lie in bed at night with his fountain pen, and he studied the shop manual. It's very, very thick. He studied it cover to cover and made notes in it. He understood that car, every nut and bolt, and how it fit together. So Jack was undiminished in his later years in his interest in technology, and that kind of explains how he lived and the kinds of things he purchased. And this is a nice photo from the 1930s, which is sort of the outgoing shot for the presentation. It's Jack and his buddy, heading off into the future for, reaching out for their destiny, which we have just reviewed in the matter of 30 or 40 minutes. So there we go, Cindy. That's some bits and pieces from this presentation that I hope people will find interesting. If there are any questions, I'm pleased, or comments, I'm pleased to address them.
That was great. Actually, Michael had sent me the link to his website and to the video. prior to this, and I watched it a couple months ago. It really is fantastic and worth a look. So be sure that you go to the website and you do watch the entire video. Yeah, he was an entrepreneur for sure and just super smart guy, eh? Into everything.
Yeah,
Into
this is a question. I mean, I'm going to have an essay that goes along with this. It's an interesting question as to why. See, Jack and his brother Bram Beardall, they were so different. Jack grew up in a very religious, sternly religious household. His father was a part-time Baptist minister. They couldn't play cards on Sundays. They couldn't watch, films on Sundays. Sundays were the Sabbath. Even my grandmother, who was a very religious person, commented on more than once to me that that things were a little on the severe side in the household. She complained about Sundays that you couldn't play cards. And so, but, Jack and Bram went off in two very different directions. I mean, Bram became a lawyer and a judge. So a conventional guy who, follows the rules and sort of helps prop up the existing authority. And Jack went in a totally different direction, making up his own rules, inventing his own life, creating his own business. And, why did that happen? Was it, some innate genius he had that allowed him to understand everything technological? Was it something he saw, in the newspaper one day that sparked his imagination? Or was it a rebellion against his very strict household? I don't know. I can only speculate.
Angela, are there any questions?
Yeah, I got a few. When Jack was starting out, was he solely responsible for paying the first amateur licenses?
I'm sure he did. I mean, there was, I have come across some information in the very early days of the station. I think this goes to the 1920s. A city council was interested in what Jack was doing, and they gave him an annual check for $50 to subsidize some of the investment in the equipment. But other than that, the history to me indicates that he somehow, came up with all the money himself. I mean, he was, by the way, appointed part-time radio inspector for the city of Chatham. Well, I think for the district, but I think it was within, did I get this right? This slide. When he's right. He was the first federal radio inspector for the district of Chatham. He was appointed in 1925. So I think that's where he got some of the money to invest in the radio equipment, that the government became aware of his early radio experiments. And so they decided to put him on salary so I guess people's receivers had to be inspected for safety reasons. And Jack performed that function in the Chatham area.
Okay.
Norm Olding, who was working with Jack, was he local as well?
I don't know if Norm was local. He was probably regional. Norm went on and had had a very successful career in radio. But I don't know if Norm was at CFCO at that time or Jack happened to know him by other means. So I'm not clear on that one.
Okay. And this is more of a comment than a question, but you were talking a lot about the materials that Jack bought and where he got things from, and he went out on a limb doing all of this. And the comment was that his wife, Ruby, must have been very supportive of all of this.
Oh, yeah. My grandmother. Oh, yeah. My grandmother was an amazingly supportive and kind person, an extremely loving person. I remember when she was interviewed for the 1976 50th anniversary show, the interviewer asked her about, I forget the exact question, but he was asking, I just want to get this right. I've got to be clear on my recollection here. I think my grandmother made the comment that many meals went cold because there was always something happening at the station that required Jack's attention. And because he was the owner, he was the manager, and he was also himself a broadcaster. So, I mean, on these labor tapes, I have him talking about situations where you know, the transmitter breaks down at the transmitter house, or somebody doesn't show up to be at the transmitter house at the right time, and he's got to get up in the middle of the night and go out there and make sure that the signal is still, it is still reaching everybody in the Chatham area. So I think that Jack certainly took some vacation time. We had a very nice cottage on Lake Erie, and we spent a month out at Erie O and later Rondo Park. He did take some time, but I think the radio business and running CFCO was really a 24/7 occupation for him. And my grandmother,
what was Ruby's maiden name?
Montgomery.
Montgomery. Okay.
Yeah. But my grandmother, she was obviously involved. She obviously had her own program at the station and was there. Also she was holding down the house so there were a lot of times when the dinner went cold and she had to put it in the fridge and warm it up when Jack got home, whenever he did. Yeah.
And you were mentioning the tapes for negotiations. So would the archives also have things like employee records, programming records more extensively?
I have programming records in the sense that I have I have 2 photos with the lists of programs that CFCO ran. So in downtown Chatham, the station had it had window setups with the list of programs and the time for all the programs. Sometimes it'd be at a local, pharmacy or some other store that had a nice big storefront. So CFCO would advertise the programming there, and that's where you would find out about it. So that, of course, you hear about it on the air, but in terms of print, it manifested itself as advertisements in downtown Chatham, I should say. Sorry.
Are there any employee records left?
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah. I think those were probably all taken over by CFCO, by the new owners of CFCO, and have probably, I would suspect, have been destroyed.
Yeah.
And one last question was about Jack's middle name, Bakey. Did it come from anywhere in particular?
That was his mother's maiden name. So okay. He was John George Bakey Beardall. Yeah.
And that's all that I have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, that was a fantastic presentation. Linda mentions, she has a comment that he was way ahead of his time. Excellent presentation. CFCO was the best radio station for news and events. We did end up posting this on a couple different Facebook sites, and it was interesting reading people's comments. There were a lot of comments about how, growing up on the family farm, that during supper, we did not get to talk. There were several people that said that they had to listen to the farm reports, to the obituary, to the in memoriams. So I thought that was quite interesting that it, was that prevalent in, every home, from the rural farmers to the city folks to, like you say, the people in Windsor and all around the world. So that just shows, the magnitude that his word and his, initiative was spread, and how people tuned in, specifically, like you said, the Sunday morning, it became I'm sure it became, something that they did every single week, was they tuned in for certain shows.
Well, that program also had a catchphrase. So it was from 10:15 to 10:45, and church was 11 o'clock in Chatham. And so he would sign off at 10:15 and say, "Don't be late for church." So that was a famous, that was his catchphrase.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say too, on this issue of being modern. I mean, when McLean Hunter took over the station, they decided that it was ready to expand considerably. So they invested in a 10,000 watt transmitter. and kind of took the signal to the next level. Although by that time there were a lot of competing signals. So at 1,000 watts, you couldn't compete with all the different signals around you. So they had to move things up, and they brought in a younger crowd. Essentially, you had the baby boomers coming in, and they were getting their chance. And they were the young Turks, and there was a kind of condescension towards that we became aware of towards the station. That was old fashioned and it was cheesy, and where the young people were going to make this thing modern and make it so much better than it was. And they did do a lot of interesting things. However, that criticism, I would say, is just really not warranted, because the thing that comes screaming at me through all of the research I've done is how modern Jack was as a person. He was a really modern person, as we would understand a modern person, at a time when not everybody was like that. A lot of people still had, were still stuck in the traditional world, or they had one foot in the traditional world and one foot in this new world of technology, and weren't quite sure how to balance it. But he was fully in the modern world and was modern in his outlook, and was like that throughout his entire life. And if you look at the programming of the station, and that's what really said this to me, is that, and I've listened to records of the programming was very professional. It wasn't kind of old-fashioned music and, old-fashioned ways of speaking. And it was very professional and very modern in its expression and in its production. And then you had all these, major American shows that Jack brought to CFCO listeners. And so I think, that is probably not something that everybody was doing. So I think the criticism of the Young Turks was, I understand why they went that way. All young people think, I'm going to do it better than it was done before. And I get it. But I think that was somewhat unfair. And I would also, so I just wanted to make that point.
Cindy?
Yes.
Richard Brooks here.
Hi.
And hi. I joined late, and so I was unable to catch how to ask a question, but I'll go ahead and
Sure.
just make a comment if you don't mind. First of all, I want to thank Michael for an excellent presentation and very informative. I personally heard your grandpa say, "Don't be late for church," several times. He, as you said, he was very, very professional, but also he had this folksy way about him that was very appealing as well. I mean, I was a kid of, I was born in Chatham in 41. Mm-hmm. And so my recollections of listening to him, I think it was likely on my way to church. Who knows? Because
mm-hmm.
I lived on a farm out by Thamesville and drove into Chatham for church. And so I really enjoyed the presentation. I did want to ask, though, my father, Jack Brooks, was a tenor soloist in the Chatham area. Uh-huh. And I know he sang on CFCO. And I'm into a little bit of a genealogical cave right now, mm-hmm. trying to find out as much as I can about my family history. And I was wondering if there is a website or a way in which I could contact you to see if there's my specific interests in the history of CFCO might be hidden away someplace that you would be aware of and could direct me.
Well, sure. I mean, you can write to Cindy, can give you my email address, or anybody who wants to write to me, you can get me at Alexander. Well, here's probably just to give you a simple address, not my professional one, just Michael Alexander 3000 at Gmail.
3000 and?
At Gmail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at gmail.com. And I had a lot of these recordings from programs, throughout the years. And unfortunately, you know, like I didn't find anything on them. They were informative in terms of the tone and the content and things like that, but they didn't capture anything that was historically important.
Yeah.
And certainly I didn't hear any performances that of the kind that you described.
Okay.
And so mostly it was announcers and the news and you know, Sunday afternoon music programming and things like that. So I actually ended up disposing of the records because they're super heavy and really difficult to store, and they were starting to deteriorate. And I did listen to all of them. It took me a long time. I had to buy a special turntable. There's only one turntable available in the world that would play these old records from the inside out. It's a DJ's turntable that I guess DJs must use for, you know, special reasons.
Yeah.
And I listened to all those records, but in the end, I had to make the decision that they were not germane to the archive project.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Richard, at the very beginning, Michael was speaking to the project. You might have missed that part that they're going to be launching. Michael, do you want to just quickly go over that again? You're launching that.
Yeah, so I'm working. So these sort of 350 some odd items that are restored, most of them photographs, but some of them scripts, and some of them material taken off tape recordings, are going to be organized and featured on a site called CFCO The Story. And that'll be up sometime before Christmas. And so everybody in the city will be able to go there. They'll be able to see this slide presentation. I'll have an essay there, and there will be other features on the site. And so it'll be kind of a comprehensive site of about the CFCO years, and you can. I hope people will really enjoy the photos as much as I did restoring them. And this will be a foundation piece for CFCO's 100th anniversary, which will be coming in 2026.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for listening to me.
Okay, and then I also know that Rick Thackeray, he's also on. He's a member as well. He had mentioned that his father worked for this station in the 1930s and early 1940s. So that's going back.
Well, so he would have been there for the big, you know, technological achievements of the 30s.
Yeah,
that would have
exactly.
been a very exciting time to be with the station.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, Angela, did you have any other questions come in?
Nope, that's all I have.
Okay, just one last comment from Linda in reply to sitting quietly and listening. And she wrote, my grandparents used to sit around the radio and in capital letters, yes, there was no talking.
Right.
Very, very strict. Okay, so when the website does launch, I would say that, you know, we'll keep in touch. You can let me know. Maybe we can advertise it. We can put in our newsletter to let people know what it actually is. And we can help to get the word out as well. So,
okay.
All right. I think that's everything. Just a reminder for people to join us on October the 8th, which is a Tuesday night, talking about your photos and your restoration and that. Our speaker is going to be talking about actually photo restoration and storage. So she comes from us from across the border of the States. So we're looking really forward to that.
Great.
And thank you so much for your presentation. Oh, sorry, I was just reading what Angela was texting, and she as well says it's a great presentation. Thank you so much. And hopefully everybody enjoyed it. And we thank you for joining us on this Friday evening. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. It was great to be with you. I look forward to seeing you in Chatham in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.